Welcome back to the Making International Law in Korea video series. In this video, I'll be explaining on the San Francisco Peace Treaty and its relevance to the sovereignty of Dokdo. When Japan agreed in Article 2 of the San Francisco Peace Treaty to renounce all rights, title, claim to Korea, including the island Kolpar, Port Hamilton, and Dazzle, the drafters of treaty did not include Dokdo within the area to be renounced. Japan has, and with reason, assumed that its sovereignty still extends over Dokdo, and the Koreans have disputed this assumption. During the drafting period of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Korea's view was solicited, and in a consequence of which, the Korean ambassador, in his letter of July 19, 1951, requested the U.S. Secretary of State to amend Article 2A of the treaty so as to include Dokdo as well as Kolpar, Port Hamilton, and Dazzle among those islands over which Japan would renounce rights, title, and claim by virtue of recognizing Korea's independence. In his reply to the Korean ambassador, dated August 10, 1951, Dean Lusk, the Assistant Secretary of State, stated that the United States could not concur in the proposed amendments as it applied to Dokdo, since, according to his information, Dokdo has never been treated as part of Korea, as it had been under the jurisdiction of the Oki Island branch office of the Japan Shimane Prefecture since 1905, and it did not appear that they had ever before been claimed by Korea. As a result, Article 2A of the San Francisco Peace Treaty made no mention of Dokdo. Accordingly, it appeared that the United States viewed that the San Francisco Peace Treaty constitutes a determination of the minor island to be left to Japan under the Potsdam Declaration, and that the treaty left Dokdo to Japan. The United States remarked, however, that its view was simply that one of the several signatories of the treaty, and that Article 22 of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, providing reference to the ICJ, was drafted in order to settle the dispute deriving from this treaty. In determining what course of action should be taken in light of these developments, the question arose whether the statement made in Dean Lusk's letter entailed the legal conclusion that the San Francisco Peace Treaty left Dokdo to Japan. On the other hand, it may be argued that the determination of the minor island to be left under Japanese sovereignty required by the Potsdam Declaration which has made by the treaty. For example, Japan retained everything not renounced under Article 2, and that Korea, prior to the signing of the treaty, specifically asked for an renunciation Dokdo by Japan and was turned down, and that therefore it was the intent of the drafters of the treaty that Japan would not renounce Dokdo, and that these islands were accordingly included in the minor islands determined to remain under Japanese sovereignty. On the other hand, it may be argued that Lusk's letter refusing to include Dokdo in the enumeration of islands renounced in the connection with the renunciation of Korea was based on the U.S. understanding of the historical facts, providing that Dokdo was, according to our information, never treated as part of Korea, and that his statement left the door open to Korea to show that it had in fact treated Dokdo as part of Korea prior to 1905, when Japanese placed Dokdo under the jurisdiction of the Shimane Prefecture. Under this theory, Korea would still be free to establish legally, if it could, that Korea, it renounced in the San Francisco Peace Treaty included Dokdo. This is all the more so given that the report on Dokdo was based for most parts on the Japanese language reference available in the Department of State in the Library of Congress, and the studies prepared within the Department of State and by the Japanese Foreign Office on some of the islands. Therefore, it is Korean view that, in light of the Allied powers' position as reflected in the Cairo Declaration of 1943 and Scapin 677 of 1946, Dokdo can be regarded as having been included among those territories of Japan. Therefore, it is the Korean view that, in light of the Allied powers' position, as reflected in the Cairo Declaration of 1943 and the Scapin 677 of 1946, Dokdo can be regarded as having been included among those territories of Korea that were removed from Japan. Furthermore, the Japanese perception of Ulleungdo and Dokdo as a single unit, the direct reference to Ulleungdo in the San Francisco Peace Treaty as part of Korean territory, may be reasonably interpreted to include Dokdo. The Korean government claims that Dokdo, the easternmost island in the sea, is an integral part of Korean territory, historically, geographically, and under international law. The Korean version of integral part of Korean territory is of which literal translation is inherent territory of Korea. Japanese government also claimed that Takeshima is indisputably an inherent part of territory of Japan in light of the historical facts and based on international law. Although it is difficult to specify the exact time when the territorial sovereignty of Dokdo was established, both Korea and Japan support their claims based on historical records. In general, Korea assumed that Dokdo became part of Korea when Silla of the Korean Peninsula conquered Usangu, Usan Kingdom, in 512 AD. Usangu consists of Ulleungdo and Dokdo. The distance from the Ulleungdo Dokdo is only 87.4 kilometers, and Dokdo is visible from Ulleungdo to the naked eye on a clear day. Although it is not clear when people began to live on Ulleungdo, historical records show that people resided there by 246 AD. On the other hand, Dokdo is not similarly visible from Oki Island of the Shimane Prefecture of Japan because the distance between the two islands reaches 157.5 kilometers. Silla was succeeded by Goryeo, and Goryeo by Joseon in 1392, and Joseon by Korea in 1948 after Japan's colony were for 36 years. Korea claimed that many historical records support Dokdo had been part of Korean territory. Among the records is Anyeongbok incident in the late 17th century. In 1693, the Japanese fishermen took two Korean fishermen, Anyeongbok and Park Oh-dun, fishing on Ulleungdo with them to Japan. The Koreans were investigated by the Baku government and finally handed over to the envoy of Tsushima Prefecture of Japan and then returned back to Busan, Korea. After the incident, the Tsushima Prefecture of Japan requested the Joseon government to prohibit its people fishing on Ulleungdo. But Joseon government refused it by reason that Ulleungdo was part of its territory. After the incident on December 24, 1965, the Baku sent a questionnaire to Dottori Prefecture concerning the jurisdiction of the Ulleungdo. Dottori Prefecture answering that the Ulleungdo and Dokdo did not belong to its jurisdiction. Based on this answer, the January 28, 1696 the Baku issued an order of prohibition of passage to Takeshima, recognizing Ulleungdo as part of Joseon territory. Korea was also claimed that this understanding of Bakuhu was succeeded by modern Japanese government. Many historical codes of Japan evidence Dokdo is not its territory. For example, the Tottori prefecture responded to the question of central government that neither Ulleungdo nor Dokdo was under the jurisdiction in 1695. The second, the 1870 report of the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the confidential inquiry into the particulars of Joseon's foreign relations, which was commissioned to investigate the circumstances under which Ulleungdo and Dokdo became part of Joseon territory, recognized that there was a consistent understanding since Baku that Dokdo belonging to Joseon territory. And third, the Daijokkan, which is the Great Council of State of Japan, and other ministry repeatedly confirmed that Ulleungdo and Dokdo were affiliated to the territory of Joseon and they had no relation to Japan. From the perspective of Korea, thus, the measure of Japan to incorporate Dokdo under the jurisdiction of Shimane Prefecture by the notice in 1905 was against international law and void. On the other hand, Japan maintained that it has established the sovereignty over Dokdo by the mid-17th century. It claimed that the government granted its people the right of passage to Ulleungdo to engage in fishing and lumbering, and Dokdo was used as an anchorage for ships on their way to Ulleungdo and fishing. However, Ulleungdo at the time was clearly belonging to territory of Joseon, and there was no historical record considering Dokdo as Japan's territory. Under the instruction of Cabinet of Japan to incorporate Dokdo into Shimane Prefecture, the prefecture issued Notice 40 on February 22, 1905. This notice included a clause providing that the island Dokdo shall be named Takeshima and from now on placed under the jurisdiction of the Oki Island, governor of Shimane Prefecture. Japan claimed that through the cabinet decision and its following measure by Shimane Prefecture, it reaffirmed the sovereignty over Dokdo, which by then had been already established.